In the previous video, we talked about energy and temperatures being two abiotic components of an ecosystem. The next abiotic component I want to talk about are the nutrients that are in an ecosystem. Nutrients are the chemical building blocks used to build up organisms. It's the fundamental materials we need in order to create cells, and cells are the basic units of all living things. Now, the word chemical sometimes gets a kind of negative connotation attached to it. People are wary of anything that contains chemicals, any kind of product which contains chemicals. But all matter is made out of chemicals, and matter is anything that occupies space and has mass, which is all of the tangible things that you can interact with. Occupy space means you could fill a container with it. So water is matter. Humans are matter. Any solid object, rocks or food that you interact with, that's matter. Air is matter. You could fill up a container of helium until it's all the way full and you can't put any more in without it bursting, so that occupies space. It has mass to it. You can weigh that container before and after. You can weigh a bucket of water, right? So anything that occupies space and has mass, anything that is material, is made out of chemicals. And then chemicals are made out of these smaller units called atoms. And atoms come in a number of different flavors, which we call elements. So each type of atom is an element. And the unique way that different atoms are combined together gives you different types of molecules. So H2O is two atoms of the element hydrogen plus one atom of the element oxygen. Carbon dioxide, which is the stuff we breathe out, is one atom of the element carbon plus two atoms of the element oxygen, CO2. We are not going to go too deeply into chemistry in this course, but it's important that you understand that all matter is made out of these atoms, and these atoms make up different molecules, and that's what chemicals and nutrients fundamentally are. You yourself are just a combination of all of these different elements. If, for example, I were to take a person and we had a pair of molecular tweezers, we're going to take that person apart atom by atom, and if I pull an atom away from them, and it's a carbon atom, an atom of the element carbon, I'm going to put it in the carbon bucket. And I'm going to take another atom away from them, and it turns out it's an atom of the element oxygen. I put that in the oxygen bucket, and I have a different bucket for every element that exists. And if you want to know how many elements there are, you can look at the periodic table of the elements. Every little square on that periodic table is a different element. And every time I pull an atom away from that person and I put it in a bucket, I'm going to fill up all these buckets. If I were to weigh them at the end, how much would each bucket weigh? How much of each element do we find inside of a human being? If we were to do that, we would find that a human being is actually 65% by mass, by weight, oxygen. We're also almost 10% hydrogen, about 9.5% hydrogen. The reason that those two added up is about 75% of our body mass is because we are actually mostly water. A large component of what our bodies is just water. Water fills our cells, it fills our blood, it fills all of our body cavities. We have a lot of water in our system, and water, H2O, has two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom. The reason why oxygen is a much larger section of this pie slice is oxygen is a heavier element than hydrogen is, and this is a by weight chart, a by mass chart. So 65% by mass of our body is oxygen. 9.5% is hydrogen. Hydrogen is the lightest element. The next element that's a big part of what we are is carbon. Carbon is amongst the most important elements in biology. Biology is the study of life, the study of living things, of organisms, and any molecule that is carbon-based is referred to as an organic molecule. That is how vital carbon is to life. Every major biological compound is a carbon-based molecule. Your sugars, your fats, your proteins, your DNA, a lot of your hormones, all of them use carbon as the fundamental framework of their structure. So after we account for all the water in our systems, the biggest chunk of what's left is carbon. About 18.5% of our body mass is carbon. The next largest component is going to be nitrogen, which is part of our DNA and our proteins, a number of other molecules as well. And then everything else represents a smaller component, your iron and your calcium, your potassium, and all these. Of the remaining materials, we are going to talk about phosphorus and sulfur and how they play a role in ecosystems specifically. So if we take a look at this chart of what materials make up our body, we're going to talk about a number of biogeochemical cycles, which is how chemicals cycle through ecosystems. And you can see which of these are the biggest components of what we are. So we're going to talk about how these materials get into the food that we eat and get into our bodies. We're going to talk about the hydrologic cycle, which takes care of our oxygen and our hydrogen. We're going to talk about the carbon cycle, which is the next largest chunk. We're going to talk about the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the sulfur cycle. One thing to note about chemical elements is that individual atoms very rarely are found just by themselves. You would very rarely find a situation where you're interacting with just a single atom of carbon or just a single atom of hydrogen, not attached to any other elements. They like to pair up together. So a lot of these cycles may involve talking about conversions from one type of molecule to another type of molecule because chemical elements are constantly undergoing chemical reactions. Here on this next slide, I have two different forms of nitrogen, nitrate and ammonia, both of which would be common in chemical fertilizers, and we also have a phosphate ion as well. And you can see that these, we're going to talk about the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle, but there will be other elements attached to these atoms as we are talking about their transition from one area to another. Another thing that we talked about is how the abiotic factors in an ecosystem influence the biotic factors, right? We talked about how temperature controls what kinds of organisms can live in a given area, how energy determines what the total amount of organisms or the total types, what kinds of predators you could have in a certain given amount of space in that ecosystem would be. And we're going to now talk about how the nutrients in an area might determine what the distribution of plants is going to be in that ecosystem. Nutrients are not always going to be distributed evenly throughout an ecosystem. You might have a river system going through one area of the ecosystem that has a floodplain, and the nutrients that are eroding away from rocks and soil up in the mountains are going to move into that floodplain periodically, but it's going to be there's going to be fewer nutrients in the soil anywhere outside of that floodplain. So you might see different types of plants in that area directly adjacent to the river than you would upland of that area where you're not going to get as much of an influx of nutrients on a regular basis. Similarly, if you have different types of plants in that area, that means you're also going to have different types of animals, different types of herbivores moving in, which are specially adapted to those conditions. So again, everything in an ecosystem has this kind of push and pull on each other. This leads to this, leads to that, leads to the next thing. In another example, maybe there is a farm nearby that uses a lot of artificial fertilizers, and that would seep into the local ecosystem. You could get excess fertilizers running off into certain areas, and that might change the composition of plants directly adjacent to that farm. So you could actually influence what the community of organisms in that natural ecosystem is just by changing the distribution of nutrients that are available in the soil. Oh, there's more nitrogen, so now this plant is actually going to have an advantage over that plant because this one's a little bit better at utilizing the resources that are now available. Typically, the two big nutrients that are going to determine how plants grow in an ecosystem is going to be nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus are going to be your limiting reagents for plant growth in any given ecosystem. If you're unfamiliar with the idea of a limiting reagent, it kind of works like this. This will be an analogy. Imagine you want to make as many cakes as you possibly can, and you have an entire warehouse full of flour. You have thousands of pounds of flour. You have gallons upon gallons of milk. You have swimming pools filled with milk, lots and lots of milk. You have truckloads of sugar constantly coming in. They're just piling up sugar and sugar and sugar all the time. You have more baking soda, or baking powder than you could possibly think what to do with, but you only have 12 eggs. So No matter how many of the other resources you have, you can only make the number of cakes that you can make with 12 eggs. Depending on the size of the cake, that might mean 1 cake or 2 cakes, but it doesn't matter how much flour or sugar or the other ingredients are there, the limiting reagent is the number of eggs. So in ecosystems, frequently the limiting reagent, the one that's in shortest supply available for plant growth, is the nitrogen or the phosphorus. They have plenty of carbon, they have plenty of hydrogen, they have plenty of oxygen, they have plenty of lots of other elements, but they need more phosphorus, they need more nitrogen in order to be able to actually catalyze that growth. So if you ever see a situation where there is an influx of nitrogen and phosphorus all of a sudden, the plants will take it up very, very rapidly, and you'll see a big boost in the amount of plant growth in that area. In particular, in aquatic ecosystems, if there's a bit of runoff from artificial fertilizers from local farms, you'll see blooms of algae begin to pop up. The entire pond or lake, whatever aquatic ecosystem we're talking about, will suddenly turn green because algae, like plants, need nitrogen and phosphorus as their limiting reagent. So once they have access to it, they grow like wild. They start dividing like crazy, and you get tons and tons and tons of this algae. Now that can be very, very bad for those aquatic ecosystems, actually, but again, we'll talk about that later on. The next chemical nutrient that we can talk about as being important to ecosystems is water. With temperature, the amount of rainfall that a given ecosystem gets is one of the main determining factors as to what the vegetation in that ecosystem is going to end up being. If you get lots and lots and lots of rainfall in a warm temperature climate, you're going to get a tropical rainforest. If you get very scant rainfall in a place with relatively warm but stable temperatures, you probably get grassland, whereas you get very, very low temperature in a place with high temperatures but a lot of variation in those temperatures, from like hot during the day, very, very cold at night. That's going to give you a desert, etc., etc. It shouldn't be surprising that the amount of water so strongly determines the type of vegetation that you can get in an area, because plants require water in order to do photosynthesis. We're going to talk about photosynthesis when we talk about the carbon cycle in a little bit, but one of the ingredients for making sugars is water. You need carbon dioxide and water in order to make sugars inside of plants. Animals like us obviously need water as well. We need to drink water every single day in order to avoid desiccation, which is the scientific term for drying out. You can go maybe 2 or 3 days without drinking water before you end up dying of thirst. Life, insofar as we've ever been able to tell, began in water about 3.5 billion years ago, and even though many organisms have transitioned to a land-based existence since then, we've never really gotten away from our dependence on water in order to maintain our body systems and stay alive. It's needed not only for certain chemical reactions inside of our cells, but also to be a fluid that fills our cells in order to allow all of the different chemicals and cellular components to be able to move around and do their jobs. Water is the material which allows our blood to be fluid and cycle carbon dioxide and oxygen and sugars and other materials throughout all of our organ systems in order to stay alive. It also has a number of other properties which make it easier for us to maintain homeostasis, or in other words, to remain healthy. Down here I have an image of a houseplant, and one is drooping way, way down, and the other one is standing stock upright. And the reason that this one is drooping down is because it hasn't been watered recently. Not only do plants use water for photosynthesis, but they also use it as a method of being able to hold themselves upright. The hydrostatic pressure of pumping water into all these plant cells actually makes them stiff and rigid, which allows the plants to kind of support themselves up against the force of gravity, even though they don't have bones and things. These are non-woody plants able to kind of hold themselves upright. So when plants haven't been watered, they lose all the water pressure from inside their cells, and that's why they begin to droop down. But then when you give them some more water, they perk right back up again. For aquatic ecosystems, obviously water is an extremely important feature. If you're a fish, water is your world. But it's not just the presence of water that's important, and it is important, but also the quality of that water. What's the salt concentration of this water? Is it too salty? Is it too fresh? A saltwater fish can't live in a freshwater environment, and vice versa. Each fish is specially adapted to the particular conditions in which it finds itself. Again, the abiotic, the non-living factors of an ecosystem determine what organisms can survive in that ecosystem. What is the pH of the water? If you've ever had a fish tank, you know that the pH is something that you really have to keep track of, or else you're not going to have the fish in that fish tank for very long. And if we're talking about aquatic ecosystems, the dissolved oxygen also then becomes a factor. For a lot of the other ecosystems we've been discussing, it's just sort of assumed that oxygen is present in the atmosphere, but if you're in an aquatic ecosystem, there might actually be very little oxygen available to you. The oxygen that fish breathe is mixed up in the water column, and some environments have less oxygen in the water than other environments do. Fish don't actually breathe water, they breathe oxygen that's mixed up in the water, which is why if you own a fish tank, you have to either constantly be changing out the water, or you have to get some sort of bubbler to continuously add oxygen to that water. On the previous slide, I mentioned that if there's an influx of nutrients, phosphorus, into an aquatic ecosystem, you could get a big bloom of algae, right? There would be a whole bunch of algae that would grow all over the place in that aquatic ecosystem. Well, algae doesn't have a very long lifespan, so it would bloom up, right? You would get all this green all over the place, and then it would die. And when organisms die, they decay. And the process of breaking down those bodies, those little cells that the algae are made of, involves using up oxygen. So all of the oxygen that's inside the water can be used up in the process of breaking down the now dead algae. So all of the water could be depleted of oxygen as a result of having nutrients come into the aquatic ecosystem, and that would mean that there's none left for any of the fish to breathe. So you end up with a whole bunch of dead fish washing up on shore. And this happens quite frequently in places where there's a lot of influx of artificial nutrients coming into aquatic ecosystems. You frequently, shortly thereafter, get blooms of algae, followed by lots of dead fish. So we change an abiotic factor of the ecosystem, the amount of phosphorus present. And that affects a biotic component of the ecosystem, the amount of algae that are available to grow in that ecosystem. But then the algae die and decay and break down, and that uses up another abiotic component of the ecosystem, the oxygen, which then affects another biotic component of the ecosystem, the fish, each of these factors having an influence on all of the other factors. Living components of the ecosystem, biotic, and non-living components of the ecosystem, abiotic.